proud to be one of the 75 national organizations in a grand alliance to save our public postal service. And we're united in the belief that a strong public postal service is our democratic right and are fighting to protect and enhance vibrant public postal services now and for many generations to come. While the primary purpose of the overwhelming majority of the Grand Alliance's member organizations are not related to the Postal Service, each and every one of us recognizes the indispensable role the Postal Service plays in American life and in helping us advance our own missions. This includes such organizations as the Center for Rural Affairs, Alliance for Retired Americans, the A. Philip Randolph Institute, and the National Farmers Union. I recently spoke with the National Family Farm Coalition about the importance of the Postal Service. Ohio member Marty Townsend, who's with the Ohio Farmers Union, said, "The local U.S. Post Office has become a source of identity for many rural communities as school systems consolidate and small businesses move or close. Additionally, the Post Service serves as a local meeting place and may host the only community bulletin board. However, the U.S. Post Office represents much more than identity and socializing. Many Americans, including those in rural communities where residents are frequently older and poorer with compromised health, rely on the Postal Service to receive prescribed medications. The U.S. Postal Service is the only service that goes the final mile in rural communities because the private deliverers do not profit by making deliveries on sparsely populated, often poorly maintained dirt and gravel roads. In addition, many rural dwellers buy hard-to-find items online or have internet-based businesses and would experience extreme hardship if they lost their local post office. Should the U.S. Postal Service be privatized, we have no doubt that private companies would find ways to avoid delivering to homes and small businesses on sparsely populated rural routes, further isolating rural residents and endangering their lives and livelihoods. My organization, Jobs of Justice, joined a Grand Alliance because we understand that the Postal Service is a central institution for all working people, because people depend on six-day services, and it is a service provided for everyone, regardless of their zip code. Today, July 26th, marks Postal Heritage Day, the anniversary of the establishment of the Post Office by the Second Continental Congress in 1775, and the appointment of Benjamin Franklin as the first Postmaster General. The U.S. Postal Service has come a long way since 1775, and in this age of e-commerce, it is more relevant than ever. But a 2006 congressionally manufactured U.S. Postal Service crisis imposed an unfair and crushing financial mandate on the Postal Service that no other government agency or private company is forced to bear. In spite of this burden, the U.S. Postal Service, with zero tax dollars, delivers nearly 500 million pieces of mail every day to 157 million addresses, no matter who customers are and where they live. It is the core of the $1.4 trillion U.S. mailing industry that employs 7.5 million people. You've probably heard that the White House is questioning the Postal Service's deals with Amazon. And in June, a White House OMB report, Delivering Government Solutions in the 21st Century, called for privatization of the Postal Service. In a few weeks, on August 10th, the White House Task Force on Postal Service Finances will issue its report. The Postal Service is indeed at the center of the swirling national debate. This briefing is an opportunity to discuss Postal Service finances and why privatization is the wrong approach. We will consider the outcomes of privatization of the postal services in other countries, as well as privatization of other public services here in the United States. We will consider the viewpoints of leading lawmakers in this issue area, as well as key stakeholders, including some of the customers who most use the Postal Service and the workers who make it all possible. We will also discuss the recently introduced bipartisan House Resolution 993, which expresses the sense of the House of Representatives that Congress should take all appropriate measures to ensure that the United States Postal Service remain an independent establishment of the federal government and is not subject to privatization. So I'd like to now introduce our panel. Please refer to the handout for a full bio for each speaker, because it's an incredible panel and there's so much I could say about each of them. So I'm going to keep my introductions short and sweet. We're going to begin. I'm going to introduce each panelist before they speak, but we're going to begin with Brian Renfro, who is the Executive Vice President of the National Association of Letter Carriers. Founded in 1889, the NALC represents over 285,000 active and retired city letter carriers employed by the U.S. Postal Service. Renfro is a second-generation letter carrier.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First, I want to say thank you all for taking some time to come. This is an important issue that's been become more and more popular to discuss, so we're fortunate to have the opportunity to give you sort of our views on what we see with the Postal Service. Before I get into my remarks, I just want to say, Sarita said I'm a second-generation letter carrier, and I represent 285,000 people. However, my father began as a letter carrier 3 years before I was born, so I literally have been involved or connected to the Postal Service every day of my life, and it's an agency that I love and a service that I personally believe is very important to our country. So what I want to do today is just briefly cover what we see as the financial issues and what we see as potential solutions to those issues. You were all, I think, given when you walked in a packet of information that included a white paper of sorts that the workforce, the organizations representing the employees distributed to the White House Task Force on the Postal Service. And what I will do is kind of highlight a few of the points that are in that document. So for more information on what I talk about, you could certainly refer to that document. But to begin, we up front agree that the Postal Service, their financial condition and the path that they are on is unsustainable. But what we have to do is find out what is the reason why, what is the problem, and what can we do to fix it. I mentioned the task force earlier. NALC, my union, that represents letter carriers, we've engaged with the task force. We've had conversation with the task force, and as I said earlier, provided them information. I guess postal-related bit that we've recently seen from the administration was in an OMB report that Sarita mentioned in her opening. And we've seen two different messages. That report called for privatization of the Postal Service. In our interaction with the task force, there was no discussion whatsoever on privatization. So it appears that the administration there's some disconnect within the administration as far as how to address these issues. So that leads us to the conclusion that these issues are likely better addressed legislatively. And there's a lot of members of Congress of both parties over the years that have done a lot of bipartisan work on postal reform legislation, and we're very appreciative of those that have spent time doing that and will continue to do that. So let's talk a little bit about the financial situation. It's largely the result of policy mistakes by the last two administrations, the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And I'm going to briefly mention three of them. Number one was a requirement in the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act of 2006 that required the Postal Service to pre-fund future retiree health benefits for employees that are going way into the future, 70, 80, 90 years, depending on what time frame you look at, and to pre-fund that amount in a 10-year period. And no other agency, no other company, public or private, has that obligation. That has been a financial burden that has caused almost 90% of the reported losses over the last 10 years for the Postal Service. The second has to do with postal rates. That same act, the PAEA I'll refer to it as, included a rate-setting cap that was tied to the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is a very general measure of inflation and is really not related directly to the universal delivery service that the Postal Service provides. Now, this mistake was compounded in 2016 when the Postal Regulatory Commission made a decision to make an exigent rate increase that was put in place in 2015 as a result or response to the Great Recession. They made it temporary. So in 2016, for the first time in nearly 100 years, postal rates dropped. So that's been a problem on the revenue side. And the third problem that has to do with the way certain holdings are reported on the Postal Service's balance sheet. For that one, I'm not going to go into discussion. It has to do with real estate and that sort of thing, but it's pretty clearly, I think, explained in the document that we provided to you. So those are the problems. What's the solutions? There are a number of ways to solve this pre-funding issue. We've seen many of them appear in legislation, and I'll just briefly touch on a few of the possibilities of how we can resolve this burden. The first and the simplest is to simply repeal the mandate. This could be done through a one-line piece of legislation. Would just relieve the Postal Service of the obligation to pre-fund, and they could follow private sector best practices of simply funding as you go, like every other company in America does. The second would be to reduce the burden of pre-funding, reduce the amount that has to be pre-funded. So rather than looking 70 years into the future, for example, we could set a target of the employees that are actually right now, if the Postal Service went out of business, they would have an obligation to pay for, which would lower that liability by somewhere in the neighborhood of $41 billion. Another is something called Medicare integration that's seen a lot of activity in this Congress. We had a House bill introduced that included the idea of integrating Medicare, like most private businesses do, with retiree health care after they retire. This issue has also been in a Senate bill, and a lot of work by a lot of people have gone into this, and we're very appreciative of the work they've done and their attempts to address the concerns that various stakeholders had with those provisions. And the last would simply be to adopt what we would call a fair pension policy, using private sector valuation methods, because before 1971, the Postal Service was a 100% part of the federal government, was taxpayer funded, so those obligations are calculated one way, and post-1971 with the Postal Service are calculated another way. And this is something that's seen some interest recently legislatively in this Congress. The main message I want to deliver is that these issues are what has to be addressed. Privatization of the Postal Service, restructuring an organization that in reality has already been restructured, are not the answer. The Postal Service is, as I mentioned, restructured. They've closed 485 of their 685 mail processing plants. They've reduced 200,000 career jobs over the last 10 years. The hours of operations have been greatly reduced in rural post offices. Labor costs have been reduced dramatically through collective bargaining, of which I've been very involved in. All told, they have slashed $14 billion in expenses annually through simple, smart decisions over the years. Now, this has not been a completely positive thing because it's resulted in some of the service issues that we see. So, to conclude, many of you in this room, particularly those of you that work for members of Congress that are in rural states, you've seen this service issue. So I encourage you very much going forward to focus on the issues that I brought up earlier about pre-funding, about rates, and let's do what we can to save this agency that's the highest rated federal agency. The Pew Research Center did a poll, and the Postal Service has an 88% favorability rating in February of 2018. So again, thanks for the time, and I look forward to hearing what our other speakers have to say.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brian. So we're going to move on in the panel. I just wanted to give a little taste of the format. We're going to hear from all of our panelists, and then we will open up for questions. So please be jotting down questions that you have, and we have mics set up for the Q&A period. And Brian, thank you again for all that you do in your leadership and for
listening to you talk through who's in our coalition. Even I was impressed. I mean, that's just it's enormous. We are the business mailing community. We broadly represent the $1.4 trillion postal-driven industry, 7.5 million workers that you heard. Those numbers are going to be updated later. this year. And we, as business mailers, put into the Postal Service either directly or indirectly through stimulating business correspondence and orders coming back more than 90% of the funding of the Postal Service. So what happens to business customers is an important piece of trying to find the right solution to preserve the Postal Service as we know it, or pretty close to it. We all know it's in great trouble. Certainly agree with what Brian had to say about that. But when you look back, it has its origins, that is the challenging conditions of the Postal Service, from the 2006 Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. 2006 was the peak year for the Postal Service. They sent around 213 billion pieces of mail and packages that year. So when the decision was made to do the obligations that Brian was talking about, particularly pre-funding of retiree health care, with upfront payments annually of $5.5 billion a year and only declining somewhat after 10 years, the Postal Service, it was generally viewed, could afford it. It was a scoring mechanism that the Bush White House and Treasury Department insisted on as a price for the bill. So everyone agreed. President Bush signs the bill into law on December 20th, 2006. 3 months later, Steve Jobs introduces this, and we're off to the races. With mobile, with social, with just an entire attitudinal shift on the part of the populace, with demographic trends heading in the wrong way for the Postal Service, technological trends, we have had constant downward pressure, and it's only accelerating on the mail, and that's not going to change. One of the saving graces from that act in 2006, and here I have to disagree with Brian, was the rate cap. Had that not been in place, particularly the last few years, you would have seen even much more flight from the Postal Service of the mail volumes that sustain it. Business mailers in particular, not only responding to their customers, but looking at their own savings possibilities and the burgeoning possibilities, particularly in marketing, from using digital channels of all kinds, have options that they never had before. And notwithstanding that, had the obligations, again, that Brian referred to not be put in place, the cost cutting that he also laid out for you, $14–15 billion over the last 10 years, would have kept up even with the somewhere near 30% loss in mail from the Postal Service over the last 10 years. So looking at what could the fix be, we think it's a two-step process. First, pass the current bills, H.R. 6076 and S. 2629. I'm sure you'll hear more about that from Ashley, whose bill it actually is, to stabilize the Postal Service short term, to do Medicare integration and other things such as a one-time rate increase. The mailers have put some skin in the game. CBO scored it at about $8.4 billion over 10 years. We're willing to do that to try to stabilize the Postal Service. Then go to step 2 and see what kinds of structural changes need to be done. There are tons of ideas out there. There's time to work through more. Don't do anything in haste. And in particular, don't do privatization. Notwithstanding what the administration has proposed as part of the government reorganization plan and what the task force may propose, privatization is a very bad idea for the universal service obligation, for service to rural America. There are many other problems associated with it. What do you do with antitrust and tax? What do you do if you only can sell the Postal Service off piecemeal? How do you make that an efficient operation? It's an enormous headache that shouldn't have to happen, and we can keep what we have with some structural changes that are less drastic than that going forward. So with that, I would also say that the business community also supports HRES 993. We encourage all of your offices to get behind it. And let's send a message that privatization just isn't the way to go. And maybe as we're talking here, so I'm about out of time, we can talk about what some of the potential solutions might be. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
So I'll start off with a little background on privatization. As a policy option, privatization has grown increasingly stronger in the U.S. following the expansion of public services by the government during the New Deal. Since the 1980s, privatization has been widely touted as a viable alternative to government-run services. While there are instances in which privatization has successfully provided services to the public, much of our recent experience indicates otherwise. As noted earlier today, the OMB's forthcoming report will make recommendations for Postal Service reform. While there are few official details of these reforms at the moment, we can get a clear sense of what's at stake if we think about three things. One, if we look to the example of nations that have already privatized or corporatized their postal services, particularly in Europe. Two, if we consider typical privatization attempts in the US. And three, if we examine the effects of previous restructuring of the Postal Service in the US. The Office of Management and Budget cites examples of Postal Service privatization in Europe as potential models for privatized USPS. While the timeline of privatization in Europe varies, the outcomes are fairly consistent, and those outcomes are inevitably not good for consumers or for workers. Proponents of privatization of private services often argue that profit motive serves as an adequate incentive to minimize costs and maximize consumer benefits. And while similar arguments were made around postal privatization in Europe, the push to maximize returns actually resulted in a drop in employment in postal services, price increases, and lower service quality. Despite projections of job gains ahead of privatization in Europe, there were notable reductions of staff size in most European post offices following implementation. For instance, privatized postal services in Germany created 16,000 jobs, but Deutsche Post, the German postal service, cut 38,000 jobs for a net loss of 22,000 jobs. In the Netherlands, there was a net drop of 12,000 jobs. From the initial transition to a privatized model in the UK through the present, postal service employment is down by 32%. It's down by 31% in Belgium and 25% in France. This has, in turn, led to a reduction in postal retail hours, decreases in mail delivery access, and consolidation of delivery routes that have negatively impacted service and access for customers. Royal Mail, the UK's private postal service, failed to meet its overall performance targets in fiscal year 2015 through 16, the year after the UK sold its remaining shares of the company. Portugal has closed almost a third of their post offices and 13% of postal access points since privatization. At the same time, prices associated with postal services have increased from 20 to 30% on average in Europe, climbing as high as a 50% increase in the UK. Price increases and workforce attrition were the only mechanisms employed to increase profit for the privately owned postal services. Public sector wages in Europe have been cut, in some cases as much as 30%, and benefits have been slashed. Turning back to the US, we should consider the impact of privatization on public services domestically, and I'm gonna have to speed this up because I have 3 minutes left. Broadly speaking, attempts at privatization in the US have not been very successful. If we look in particular to the example of Chicago, in the 2000s, Chicago privatized their parking meters. This, in the end, it resulted in large gains for the Goldman Sachs-led consortium that oversaw the leasing of the parking meters, but it did not benefit the citizens of Chicago, who oftentimes saw rate increases of up to 100% from 2008 to 2013, and often contended with broken meters and overcharging. Moving ahead, let's see. As was discussed earlier, much in the USPS balance sheet is misleading and in part the result of policy mistakes. The Postal Service is and can be a viable public enterprise. USPS is uniquely positioned to expand services as a means of generating revenue. USPS owns over 8,000 properties totaling over 300 million feet of interior space as of 2012 in towns and cities across America. These are community hubs that can easily perform services such as driver's license renewal, the renewal of permits and other licenses while earning additional revenue. Postal banking is perhaps one of the most attractive expanded service options. Such a system would provide basic services such as simple checking and savings accounts, issuing debit cards, and would generate revenue while increasing the economic security of millions of unbanked Americans. The promise of a robust postal service is a vital public good. We've seen the privatization of public goods and services often benefits the private owners at the expense of the public, resulting in outcomes for consumers and workers that are less than optimal. It's clear that if allowed to address past restructuring, a public USPS can thrive. The passage of legislation such as House Resolution 993, written to preserve the integrity of the Postal Service as an independent establishment of the federal government, plays a critical role in allowing the USPS to uphold its mission of providing affordable, universal service. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for that. It was really helpful to hear.
Is very passionate about postal issues, and we really enjoy, obviously, getting to work with such a large postal stakeholder community. So special thanks, obviously, to the Grand Alliance and APWU for having me here today. But I wanted to talk, I guess, a little bit first, and you mentioned this so kindly in the opening. Senator Heitkamp has been very focused on service, and I think probably most people in this room understand this, but obviously there might be some who don't. So I just want to make the comment that when we talk about service, right? My boss has obviously been focused, and she says strong service. But there's a difference between when we look at service standards and service performance. So obviously the service standard for first-class mail is technically 2 to 3 days. But service performance is the time it actually takes for that mail to get delivered from point A to point B. So when you hear people complain about service and they say, gosh, this is taking so long, what they're actually talking about is service performance. And so what we hear in North Dakota a lot, we had one story actually where a lady sent a letter to her mom on the other side, and that took 12 days. Obviously, that should never take 12 days. So Senator Heitkamp has been particularly passionate about that piece and has really advocated over the last few years to make sure service is included in any comprehensive postal reform. And to that end, I would talk a little bit about, the importance of bipartisanship on this issue. You wouldn't believe it, but maybe you would, I guess, in Congress, right? But things get very partisan very quickly around here. But honestly, postal is something that literally impacts every single American. And I think people forget that sometimes. And it's something that really, it's in, obviously, rural communities in particular have a heavy reliance on that. That's something we hear about a lot in North Dakota, but it's also also all over the country. You know, this is something, I think it was earlier, you were talking about sort of, you can't really quantify the Postal Service. It's kind of the central part of the community. And it really is, you know, in a lot of places. So, but I think the bipartisanship is so important because you can really build, I think, unique relationships on this issue. So my boss actually does have a good partnership with Congressman Meadows over on the House side, who has some of the similar rural issues, obviously, in North Carolina. And they actually met with the Postal Task Force together. They felt it was important to do a bipartisan meeting a few weeks ago, I think it was near the end of June, and had a productive discussion. I would agree with the comments also that were made earlier. It felt like, you know, there was this privatization proposal put out by OMB, but, you know, I will say my boss felt like her discussion with the task force was a productive one. But again, people need to see people working together like this on this issue because, again, it is something that really affects everyone, right? And Congress is representing the postal customer. And I think that voice is not remembered enough. So regarding, you know, something else I would want to mention, and I'll get to the bill, I promise as well, but, you know, the impact of privatization is something that would really hurt rural America and would really leave them behind. And that was something that my boss really wanted to emphasize to the Postal Task Force, and she did in that meeting. Also, you know, privatization is not really a politically popular thing, so I think that is helpful for sure in sort of this debate. But because my boss, I think, feels so strongly about this in rural America, she actually did file a bipartisan amendment with Senator Moran, Senator Carper, Senator Roberts is now on it as well. That is essentially would protect any funds in the FSGG, you know, minibus that you all have probably been paying attention to from being used towards privatization or being used to, you know, negatively impact the fulfillment of the universal service obligation. So we are pushing very hard on that. We've been engaging a lot with leadership, obviously. And if you see me looking at my phone, I promise that's what I was looking at because it's going to be a little bit of a crazy day. But if we're able to push for something like that, I think that only helps, I gotta hurry, only helps keep the momentum up for Postal, right? I think if people see Congress really unified in this message, that really helps us get this legislation done. You wouldn't, I mean, Postal has taken a long time. We haven't gotten a bill passed since 2006. So as much as we can keep momentum going, that's really important. And so I would ask, you know, any of you who have questions, please reach out to me. But, you know, obviously, please, you know, push your boss or folks in your office to really support the idea of pushing for an amendment like this, because I think that'll really help pave the way to getting reform done. And on that note, we do have the Senate bill. Art actually did a really good job going over that earlier. But I really think it's a start. You know, my boss will never say that's the perfect bill. She thinks it gives the Postal Service an opportunity to rehydrate. They need a chance to make decisions from a place where they're not doing things like cutting service, which hurt rural America. And I think that would really give them that breather to do so. So one final note, you know, she really is working with folks in the House as well, like Congressman Meadows, to figure out how we really find, I think, the common ground between those bills. And if you look at them, I think you'll also see they're not too different. But anyway, thank you for having us, and please direct any questions you have about any of the legislation I mentioned to me. So thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ashley.
What you guys had to say up here. And, again, I work for Congressman Rodney Davis from Illinois. And here we go. But no, we're the lead Republican on House Resolution 993, which is definitely something that my boss feels very strongly about. And you know, like these guys have talked about, it is a huge bipartisan effort right now. There's 11 Republicans on the bill. We have 48 co-sponsors. And I'm kind of here to urge you to go back and talk to your boss and share what you've learned here today and, you know, express how important it is to not privatize the Postal Service. And, you know, we are kind of continuing to watch the White House and see what OMB is going to do exactly with their plan. And we're watching that very closely. But, again, I urge you to go back, talk to your bosses, and ask them to co-sponsor House Resolution 993. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thank you again. Huge thanks to your boss for his leadership on this as well. With that, let's open it up for.
First off, just in terms of sheer size, the effect is going to be you're going to have a lot more people who have reduced access than is the case in Europe. But as it stands, due to the last mile standard that the Postal Service has, the Postal Service reaches people in remote areas that a lot of commercial carriers do not. And that's a very important point to remember. If access is restricted, it's likely that private companies might have to raise rates to try and make up for the difference in not having access to those areas and having to build infrastructure in those areas.
Thank you.
Advocacy matters. So the NALC came to visit Congressman Cleaver, who I represent, Missouri 5th District. Print and Packaging came. Paul Mark is in our district. And postal supervisors. The advocacy makes a difference. We signed on to HR 6076. Intend to sign on to this as well.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for reminding us that advocacy matters here. That's great. Please.
Who would be the winners from privatization? Where's this drive for privatization coming from? Who would profit from it?
The question, in case people couldn't hear, is who are the winners in a proposal for privatization?
Probably no one. If you look at the system, there's no one who would want to take it over, to buy it, to take it as a spin-off. If you were to ask companies that would readily come to mind, such as UPS and FedEx, and believe me, they've been asked about this, they want to stay miles away from that. Right now, and many of you already know this, that UPS and FedEx use the Postal Service for last mile delivery because when you have very little density of deliveries, it's very hard to turn a profit by delivering out there in Alaska or North Dakota or wherever it might be, Montana. So no one is going to want to take those routes. So by default, they're going to either come back to the government, in which case it's going to have to be taxpayer financed, or it's not just going to be that some company will build out its facilities, it's that those places won't get service.
Are there other thoughts? Please. Yeah.
Whenever. I was just going to comment, I think, and echo, I think, Art's points, particularly on the rural communities. You know, when you asked who are the winners, well, I can tell you the losers are going to definitely be the rural communities, you know, because it isn't as profitable to serve those areas. And so that's, I think, why people are sort of, you know, why the reaction, I think, has been pretty strong to obviously seeing that OMB proposal. But that's also why, you know, I really appreciated the comment about advocacy. That's so important. People need to keep hearing about it. They need to keep hearing from different groups, or else they're not going to realize that, okay, this is something we've really got to focus on, or else this could actually be a reality, you know? And I think you've got a lot of people who've been doing just exceptional messaging on all of this, which is fantastic. But it is, I mean, I think it's really important that we keep it up. The momentum, I think, has to stay strong, for sure.
Alan, please, it looks like you were going to.
And I agree with the points made. I just add that one potential winner, it wouldn't be a question of service provision. One potential winner might be real estate investment trust. I mean, we're talking about a lot of land that's out there. If remote areas aren't being serviced, and it's a question of what to do with those properties, there's a good chance that those could be sold off as part of privatization.
Please, Brian, and then we'll go to your question in a moment.
Sure. Sorry, man. I mentioned this in my remarks. The idea of privatization has only been really mentioned by private shippers. So it's, I think, fair to say that a failing postal service would, in places where it's profitable to deliver, drive additional volume and revenue to private shippers. And I'm not just talking about UPS or FedEx. It could be there's all sorts of startups out there and that kind of thing. But I think it's also important to emphasize that if that volume where it's profitable to deliver was driven to them, everyone else suffers. So in the long run, I think Art's conclusion is correct. is correct, that there would be no benefit for anyone. Thank you.
Great. Yes, please.
So as carrier technology advances, do any of you all see any opportunities to increase productivity or cost efficiencies through the use of technology such as drones or anything of the like?
Yes, that has happened over the last decade or so, and we certainly believe that as technology improves and we continue to embrace it, that it'll continue to increase. As far as drones with the Postal Service, I think the nature of the work would make it very difficult to use something like that. But certainly the technology that our carriers use every day is over the last 10 years has just increased dramatically. And it's not just the technology they use, the way our assignments are structured or in the most optimal way we can route them, the most efficient way. So technology is being used more and more and more every day, including to give you, the customer, what you want. You know, see what mail is going to arrive in your mailbox later today. So overall, I think the Postal Service has done a good job of embracing technology and has, over time, focused more and more of their efforts to do that and take advantage of what's there.
Please, go ahead.
Hey, so I definitely hear the questions about how would privatization affect rural America, and that's definitely a concern. My question is, obviously privatization isn't the ultimate evil since it's government control of the USPS that has gotten us to this sort of chaotic position that we're in now. So my question is there a way to restructure it to where it remains not privatized, quote unquote, but not also constrained to the whims of Congress, which, as we've seen, for the last 12 years hasn't been able to fix a problem that they created? That's my question.
Probably not. Postal Service is in the Constitution. So it's Congress's responsibility, regardless of what Congress does with it. And if you go back to the Postal Reorganization Act in 1970, that was passed under the slogan of take Congress out of the Postal Service. And to a considerable extent, the system and its regulation were completely delegated out. But Congress always maintained an oversight role, and whenever there's anything that requires serious change, it's going to require legislative change. So there's no way to really do that.
I'll just add one thing. The premise of the 2006 Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act was to allow the Postal Service to operate more like a business. So moving forward, I think a lot of the things we've talked about, the legislative fixes, are to continue making progress in that direction so that we would be able to operate more like a business. There is, I think, no disagreement among anyone that a drastic change to completely take Congress out of the Postal Service just simply won't happen, so it's probably not worth spending much time or energy on. I think it's more of sort of progressive steps to sort of keep up with the times, so to speak.
Do you want to add? Yep. Go ahead.
You go first.
And just to build on Vice President Renfro's points, as long as Congress doesn't impose any restrictions on the U.S. Postal Service that are impositions that the private sector doesn't, that are impositions that aren't imposed on the private sector, such as the pre-funding mandate, I think that's something that's definitely worth considering if we're trying to think of how Congress can resolve the problems that they've caused in the past.
And on that note, I would just comment that, that is why we've worked really hard to come up with legislative packages that would give the Postal Service more flexibility to make these decisions, would give them the ability to really expand on non-postal services and other things like that. But again, and again, I don't mean to say that, my boss is the first to say, in fact, she said it a million times, I think, Congress needs to do its job. We really do. We really need to give the Postal Service the flexibility it needs. So while I know that it has taken far too long for us to do that, I will say there are members really on both sides of the aisle who do want to get this done and who are looking at I think, bipartisan fixes here. But I would also say, I think, Art, this was in your comments earlier about the different parts of this, legislation being number one, and then restructuring. Like I said before, no bill is going to fix the Postal Service forever, right? We're always going to have, the mail is going to keep changing, technology will keep changing. I imagine we'll have to come back and look at this again in a few years. But in that time, I think the Postal Service, if we're able to give them this breathing room and really give them the ability to rehydrate, then they can, I think, look towards making whatever other structural decisions they need to make. It's just when you're constantly in a place where you're not able to make decisions from I think, stability, I think it really puts them in a really tough place. And I think that's why, Congress, it's well past time. It really is. And but there are members who do want to fix this, for sure.
I'm curious if you've looked into, is there any Fortune 500 company that could have had the kind of pre-funding requirements imposed on them and remained solvent?
It's true that no company has it imposed on them. In other words, it's something that they absolutely have to do. Typically what we see, and Alan might even be better to comment on this than me, but it's sort of when you're profitable, you do it. Certainly, I think it's no different than an individual saving money. But when you're not profitable and you go through a lot of what Art talked about with the reduction in volume and obviously revenue dropping, it just simply makes no sense to have to do it in that circumstance. So, essentially what we're saying is definitely fund, and they funded $50 billion in retiree health benefits for future retirees already. There's really no example of large companies, certainly that if they were not forced to, that did that while they were not profitable. There's plenty of examples of pre-funding when they were profitable.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add on to that, or
Fully
he
agree
got
with
it?
everything Brian had to say there.
Okay, great. Yes, please.
Hi, this is a little bit more of a comment than a question, but you didn't mention Canada amongst the countries that you mentioned with bad postal services, but I lived there for a while, and I will tell you that it has got to be the worst postal system I've ever seen in my life, and it's partially privatized, and that's probably why it's so bad. They lose the mail all the time, or it gets kind of ripped up. It takes a zillion years to get to you, even if it's going from one nearby place to another. They close too many sorting centers. That's what happens when you do that. It slows everything down. And they allow umpteen different little pharmacies to be post offices. And then think about how many places they have to go to pick up the mail. So partial privatization, you didn't mention that. It's not a good idea at all from what I saw. Recently, I mailed my daughter something. I expect it might get to her in a month, okay, in Toronto, which is a major city, from one major city to another major city. And the postal clerk down here in the house said, when I said, well, maybe I'll put some extra money on it, make it go faster, and she just looked at me and she said, you don't need to do that. She said, the slowness is on the other side of the border. So, this is what happens. They don't even do door delivery anymore. Think about how dangerous that is in a really cold place like North Dakota is, or anywhere in Canada is in the winter. You stop in the middle of a road on ice to go out and get your mail. This is just bad. So they went down a road that took them to really bad service, and we don't want to go down that road. I saw what that road looks like. It's not good.
Thank you for sharing that and for raising the issue of partial privatization. Appreciate that. Seems like you have a question.
Thank you very much. Could someone just remind me the number of the House resolution, please? Or the gentleman from Mr. Davis's office, what was it? 993? Thank you very much.
Yes, and is there information, there's information on the table out there on it. Thank you. Wonderful. Any other lingering questions? Okay, well, first of all, can we please thank this incredible panel? Thank you to everyone. I do hope this briefing was helpful just to help surface what we're really, what are some real problems that we need to be addressing, some possible solutions, and just giving us a little more texture to this conversation and this incredible debate that's playing out. We do hope that you'll take us seriously when we talk about the solutions, the legislative solutions that are out there right now, and really take action right now on HR, the House bill that we've been talking about. And there's information outside on the table if you didn't get it to learn more. And in the meantime, I want to really thank the APWU and a Grand Alliance for sponsoring with this briefing, and certainly everyone on the panel, again, for all of your really great work and insights on this debate. So thank you.
Nice job.
Thank you. Thanks so much.